Hey, welcome back. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi, and this is the Curiosity Compendium. You know, living in New York, you get used to things moving. The traffic, the people, the constant hum of energy. But sometimes, the most profound movements happen in the quietest places. Imagine a vast, silent desert. A flat, dry lakebed so barren, and still it feels like another planet. And on this floor, there are trails. Long, meandering scars in the earth, as if someone dragged a heavy stone across the mud. But here's the thing. At the end of each trail, there is a stone. A rock, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. And for nearly a century, no one had ever seen them move. This is the mystery of the sailing stones of Death Valley. For decades, these rocks, sitting in a place called the Racetrack Playa, presented a puzzle that defied logic. They slid, they turned, they left these beautiful, solitary trails across the desert floor, and they did it all in absolute secrecy. It was a geological magic trick performed for an audience of no one. And today, we're going to unravel exactly how that trick works. Let's set the stage. Death Valley, California. It's a name that tells you everything you need to know. It's one of the hottest, driest, most inhospitable places in North America. And within it lies the Racetrack Playa. A playa is just a dry lakebed, a flat expanse of sediment that was once underwater. The racetrack is about 3 miles long, and it's almost perfectly flat, a giant, natural sheet of cracked mud. And scattered across it are these rocks, from small fist-sized stones to massive boulders. They're trails, some straight, some curving in elegant loops, some making sharp right-angle turns, can be hundreds of feet long. The first documented reports of them came in the early 1900s, and the theories that followed were creative. People suggested everything from magnetic fields and mischievous spirits to, of course, aliens. But the most persistent theory involved the wind. The stones must be pushed by powerful gusts. But that never quite added up. The rocks were too heavy. The playa's surface, when dry, is too hard and rough. Pushing a 300-pound rock across it would be like trying to push a brick across sandpaper. The wind alone couldn't do it. So the mystery deepened. The key, it turns out, wasn't in the air, but in the rare and perfect combination of water and ice. For a long time, this was just a hypothesis. Scientists thought that maybe, during the winter, the playa would get just enough rain to form a thin, shallow pond. On cold desert nights, that water would freeze into sheets of ice. Then, perhaps as the sun came out, the ice would break up into floating panels. A strong wind could then push these ice sheets, which would act like a moving platform, nudging the rocks embedded in them across the slick, muddy floor below. It was an elegant theory, but for it to be proven, someone had to see it happen. And the Racetrack Playa is remote, harsh, and the conditions for movement are incredibly rare. For years, researchers would set up cameras and GPS monitors, only to be met with silence. The stones were stubborn. They refused to perform on cue. Then, in late 2013, a team led by a scientist named Richard Norris finally caught them in the act. They used a clever method. They planted inexpensive, weatherproof GPS units inside some of the rocks. And that winter, the perfect conditions aligned. A light rain fell, covering the playa in just a couple inches of water. Then, as temperatures dropped, a thin sheet of window pane, ice formed on the surface. Not a thick, solid block, but a fragile, floating pane. As the sun rose the next day, the ice began to melt and crack. And here's the beautiful part. It didn't need a hurricane. A light breeze, maybe just 10 miles per hour, was enough to push these large sheets of ice across the shallow water. The rocks, partially embedded in the ice, became like sails on a tiny, frozen boat. They glided, they scraped, they left their signatures in the soft mud beneath the ice. And because the ice sheets broke up and moved in different directions, driven by subtle shifts in the wind, the rocks could move in parallel, or turn, or even stop and start, creating those complex, curving trails. After nearly a century of wondering, we had our answer. The stones sailed. I find myself thinking about this a lot from my perspective as an engineer and a storyteller. We looked at these trails for decades and saw a problem to be solved, a literal mystery written in the dirt. And our first instinct was to assign a grand, forceful cause, a powerful, constant wind. But the truth was far more delicate. It wasn't about brute force. It was about a perfect, fragile, and temporary set of conditions. A little water, a thin skin of ice, a gentle, persistent nudge. It's a reminder that sometimes movement isn't about power. It's about timing and context. It's about reducing friction so much that even the slightest push can move something monumental. In our own lives, we often try to push through resistance with sheer will. But maybe the lesson from these stones is to look for the conditions that allow for graceful movement. To find our own version of that slick, icy surface that lets us glide forward with the energy we already have. So the next time you feel stuck, think of the sailing stones of Death Valley. Remember that in one of the most still and severe landscapes on Earth, rocks hundreds of pounds heavy slide across the desert floor. They don't move because of a constant, raging storm. They move because of a rare, perfect alignment of subtle elements. They move because they found a way to let the world carry them, just for a little while. The mystery is solved, but the wonder remains. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curiosity Compendium. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please share it with a curious friend. It truly helps the show grow. This podcast is a production of Light Knot Studios. You can find more of our storytelling work and learn how we tie together ideas, education, and narrative at our website, lightknotstudios.com. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi. Until next time, stay curious.